On a sweltering August evening in Opelika, Alabama, a small town where everyone knew each other's routines, a quiet woman's life ended in mystery. At exactly 8 o'clock, Martha Ann Coleman, a 42-year-old librarian, stepped out of the red brick library where she had worked for years. She carried her brown purse, wore her light blue shirt, and followed the same path she had taken countless times before. A neighbor caught a glimpse of her silver car turning south onto Highway 431, its tail lights shrinking into the night. That simple sighting should have been unremarkable, just another ordinary drive home, but it was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. Minutes later, Martha vanished, and Opelika would spend the next 18 years haunted by her absence. Why did a woman known for her punctuality and careful habits disappear without a trace, leaving no phone call, no message, no sign of where she had gone? Who was waiting for her on that dark stretch of Highway 431? And how could an entire town overlook the clue that would one day unravel everything? If you want to uncover these answers with us, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and turn on the bell icon for upcoming episodes. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and let us reach 5,000 likes so more people can join this search for the truth. The summer night of August 12, 2005, did not announce itself as anything unusual. The air was heavy. The streets hummed with cicadas, and inside the library the ceiling fan spun lazily, moving warm air over the rows of books. Martha's farewell was routine, her smile calm, her steps measured. She slid behind the wheel of her car and disappeared into the blur of headlights and shadows. What seemed like a regular evening ended with silence that lasted almost 2 decades. A silence that would later reveal a story darker than anyone in Opelika could imagine. Opelika, Alabama was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked and days unfolded at a gentle pace. Family-owned shops lined the main street, a coffee spot kept its regulars, and the red brick church towered as the heart of Sunday gatherings. Life here carried a rhythm that had little use for surprises. At the center of this rhythm stood the modest public library, a place filled with the smell of paper and the hum of that old ceiling fan. Among the stacks worked Martha Ann Coleman. She was known as a woman of steady habits, someone who greeted visitors with a quiet kindness and always offered help to children searching for their first chapter books, or to elders looking for the large print shelves. She lived alone in a small house not far from the library, but she was never isolated. Neighbors waved to her at dusk as she pulled into her driveway, her schedule as reliable as the streetlights that flickered on each evening. Martha's punctuality was not just noticed, it was trusted. People in Opelika often said that if you wanted to know what time it was, you could simply watch Martha walk home. She represented the dependable spirit of a community where routine meant safety and where familiarity wrapped itself around every corner. But when such a person fails to arrive where they are expected, the absence rings louder than any alarm. And in Opelika, that sudden silence would soon echo across the town in a way no one could ignore. The following day would reveal the first cracks in that trust, and a discovery that turned quiet concern into deep fear. Would you like me to continue with the part where the last normal evening of Martha's life begins to unfold? Friday evening, August 12, 2005 began like so many others inside the modest Opelika library. The day was winding down and the last of the patrons slipped quietly through the doors. Martha gathered stray books from the tables, stacked them neatly on the return cart, and straightened the magazines by habit more than need. Her brown purse rested on the counter, ready for the short drive home. She wore her familiar light blue shirt, one her colleagues often saw at the end of summer days when the heat clung to the walls even after sunset. As the clock neared 8, Martha offered a calm farewell to the 2 co-workers still shelving books. They remembered the small smile she carried, the same one she gave at the end of every shift, as if closing the day was a ritual she respected. Nothing about her voice, her steps, or her posture suggested fear or worry. She pushed the door open and the warm air outside swallowed her whole. Moments later, A neighbor noticed her silver car easing onto Highway 431, its taillights glowing briefly against the tree line before thinning into the night. It was an ordinary sight on an ordinary road, but it would become the last image of Martha known to the living. Beyond that fading red glow, her path was lost. That moment on the highway formed a boundary line. On one side stood the familiar comfort of routine. On the other side stretched a silence that would deepen into 18 years of unanswered questions. The following morning, Opelika would discover that the clockwork routine of Martha Ann Coleman had stopped, and that discovery would pull her quiet town into the shadows of fear. Would you like me to continue with the part where her sudden absence begins to alarm those closest to her? The following morning in Opelika should have opened with routine. The library staff expected Martha to arrive early, as she always did, to unlock the doors and prepare the desk before the first visitors appeared. Instead, her desk sat strangely empty. The chair remained pushed in, the mug she always filled with coffee had not been touched, and the phone on her counter rang without answer. At first, her coworkers tried to explain it away, but unease crept in quickly. Martha had never once failed to appear without calling. By mid-morning, her brother Daniel decided to drive to her house. He found the curtains still drawn tight against the heat, the bed neatly made as if she had never returned the night before, and the kitchen untouched with no sign of a late meal. Her car was not in the driveway, but there was no evidence that she had packed anything or prepared to leave. To Daniel, the silence in that house was heavier than words. He contacted the Opelika police and filed a missing person report. Officers did not dismiss his concern. They knew Martha's reputation for reliability, and they knew the town well enough to recognize when a disappearance did not fit the pattern of someone choosing to vanish. Almost immediately, they began considering the possibility that something beyond her control had taken place. What started as a morning of unanswered calls was about to unfold into a frantic search, one that would lead investigators and volunteers alike into the pine woods and along the shoulders of Highway 431. But what they would soon find was far more unsettling than anyone expected. Would you like me to continue with the part where the first searches begin, and Martha's car is finally discovered? When the report of Martha's disappearance reached the Opelika police, the response was immediate. Patrol cars began tracing the familiar roads between the library and her home, searching for any sign of her silver car. Bloodhounds were brought in, their handlers guiding them along the ditches and fence lines. Officers walked side by side in wide grid patterns through open fields, hoping to catch even the faintest trace of her path. As word spread through the town, volunteers arrived in growing numbers. Families, church members, and neighbors joined the search, calling Martha's name into the heavy August air. They combed through pine woods, peered down culverts, and dragged flashlights across darkened fields when the sun dipped below the horizon. Hope mixed with fear, each shout of her name returning only silence. Then, late in the search, an officer spotted something near the shoulder of a narrow road branching from Highway 431. There, half hidden by brush, sat Martha's silver car. The driver's side door hung ajar. Her brown purse rested on the passenger seat. The keys still sat in the ignition, waiting as if she had only stepped away for a moment. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints leading clearly away. The vehicle stood as a chilling question mark in the middle of the investigation. The scene was sealed quickly, yellow tape stretching across the roadside as officers ordered everyone back. Whispers began to ripple through the gathered crowd. Anxiety surged through Opelika, a town that had never known such a shadow. The car's discovery proved Martha had not left by choice. Something had stopped her. Something had taken control of her final moments, and yet, even with this discovery, there was no clear trail to follow. The search was only beginning, and whispers in the community soon turned toward those who might have known more than they claimed. Would you like me to continue with the part where suspicion grows and the first witnesses begin to shape the investigation? With Martha's car recovered but no clear answers, investigators widened their focus. The search radius stretched 10 miles in every direction from the place her silver car was found. Officers pushed through fields and tree lines. Volunteers trudged through tall grass with flashlights. Bloodhounds were released again, their noses pressed close to the ground. But the dogs picked up her scent for only a few hundred meters before it vanished completely, as if she had been lifted from the earth. Rumors began to swirl. A woman who lived near the highway reported that she had heard a short, sharp scream that same night, carried faintly through the heavy air. Another witness claimed they had seen a pair of headlights turning abruptly down an unmarked dirt road, not far from where Martha's car would later be found. Others whispered that she had spoken of feeling watched in the days before her disappearance. Yet when investigators pressed for details, none of these leads held steady. They were fragments of a puzzle without a clear fit. Alongside these accounts came discoveries that stirred both hope and dread. Searchers found objects scattered along the roadside: a scarf, a receipt, a cigarette lighter. Each one raised the question of whether it belonged to Martha, only for careful checking to show they did not. With every false lead, the weight of disappointment grew heavier. For a town desperate to hold on to her trail, each discarded clue felt like losing her all over again. The investigation was moving quickly, but the lack of solid evidence made the ground beneath it unstable, and in that uncertainty, attention soon shifted toward a man who lived close by, a man whose history with Martha would place him under a sharp and unforgiving light. Would you like me to continue with the part where suspicion turns toward Richard Rick Dawson, and investigators begin to examine his every move? As investigators sifted through scattered clues and fading witness reports, one name began to rise above the noise. Richard Rick Dawson. He was 28 years old, a local mechanic who lived not far from Martha. People in Opelika knew him for his skill under a car hood, but they also knew his quick temper. Police records showed a handful of minor arrests, bar fights, and disorderly conduct. Nothing that marked him as dangerous in the eyes of the law, but enough to paint a picture of a man who struggled to control his anger. What drew investigators closer was his history with Martha herself. Just a year earlier, the two had argued bitterly over a property fence that separated their yards. Neighbors remembered voices raised and accusations thrown. Although the dispute had eventually cooled, the memory of that conflict placed Rick firmly in the circle of suspicion once Martha disappeared. Proximity and history were not proof, but they were reason enough to look closer. Detectives sat across from him in the small interview room and asked him to account for his night. Rick insisted he had been at work until the early morning hours, fixing cars at the garage where he was employed. His manager confirmed it. Coworkers backed his claim. His alibi was solid enough to hold. Searches of his home and property revealed nothing unusual, no sign of Martha, and no physical evidence tying him to her disappearance. The absence of phone records that could contradict his story only strengthened his defense. He was not cleared, but he could not be charged. For the Opelika police, it was a frustrating turn. They had a man who seemed to fit the shadows, but not the evidence. Rick Dawson was officially labeled a person of interest and nothing more. The momentum of the case began to slow, leaving the town restless and uneasy. But as weeks passed and the investigation faltered, the silence around Martha grew deeper, and Opelika braced for the chilling possibility that her case might slip away. And soon that is exactly what began to happen. Would you like me to continue with the part where the search loses steam? The town feels the weight of fear and the case begins to go cold. As the weeks turned into months, the urgency that had once driven Opelika began to wane. The search parties that had filled the fields and back roads grew smaller with each passing day. Volunteers who had shouted Martha's name into the woods now returned quietly to their lives, weighed down by exhaustion and the absence of answers. The media, which had first swarmed Opelika with headlines and cameras, slowly shifted its gaze elsewhere. For the town left behind, the silence grew heavier. Fear began to alter the very rhythm of daily life. Doors that had once stood unlocked were now bolted at night. Children who had played freely along sidewalks were kept closer to home. Neighbors who had once lingered on porches after dark now stayed inside, blinds drawn against the night. The disappearance of one woman had reached into every household, and routine was no longer a source of comfort. Inside the police department, the case of Martha Coleman became the subject of quiet debate. Detectives pored over the same reports again and again, tracing the same thin lines of evidence that led nowhere. Meetings ended in frustration. Every promising lead dissolved before it could be held. By the end of that winter, the decision was made. The file was officially designated a cold case. For Martha's family, the word cold carried a cruel weight. Her brother Daniel refused to let the silence swallow her name. He pressed the department for updates, searched on his own, and spoke her story to anyone who would listen. Grief mixed with determination, and even as the town began to accept the absence, her family carried the fight forward. The official search may have ended, but unanswered questions still lingered in every corner of Opelika. And years later, when the case was finally reopened, those questions would come roaring back with force. Would you like me to continue with the part where the case is revived after long years, and new attention uncovers unsettling details? 5 years had passed since Martha Coleman vanished, and Opelika had grown used to living with the shadow of unanswered questions. Then in 2010, a new voice stepped forward. A man contacted the police claiming that on the night of Martha's disappearance, he had seen a car parked along the highway with its door open. His memory had stayed buried for years, but something compelled him to speak at last. At first, investigators felt a flicker of hope. The detail of the open car door matched perfectly with what had been found when Martha's silver vehicle was recovered. Perhaps this witness had seen something vital, something overlooked, something that could breathe life back into a file gone cold. For a moment, Opelika dared to hope that the silence might finally break. But when detectives compared his account against their existing records, the weight of disappointment returned. Everything the man described was already known, already documented, already exhausted. His words, though sincere, added nothing new. The case could not be reopened on repetition alone. What seemed like a breakthrough dissolved into another dead end. For Martha's family, the letdown was crushing. To be lifted toward the possibility of answers, only to be dropped back into silence deepened the ache of those long years. The town, too, felt the sting. Whispers of hope had stirred old fears, and when nothing came of it, the silence felt even heavier. Still, time has a way of shifting shadows. While the year 2010 closed without progress, whispers would continue to stir, and years later the case would once again step out of its long darkness. Would you like me to continue with the part where nearly a decade later, new energy is poured into the investigation and the cold file is reopened? By 2011, the weight of silence had stretched into something even heavier. Martha's mother, who had held on to every sliver of hope, passed away without ever learning what happened to her daughter. At her funeral, family members whispered the same truth they all carried in their hearts. She had left this world with questions still locked in her hands. The pain of that loss deepened the wound already carved by Martha's disappearance. The vigils that had once filled the town square with candlelight began to grow smaller. Where once hundreds had gathered, only a few faithful stood with flickering flames and bowed heads. Reporters who had once filled notebooks with questions no longer visited. Headlines that had once shouted Martha's name now fell silent, replaced by other stories, other towns, other tragedies. On the surface, Opelika regained its calm. The shops reopened each morning. The church bells rang on Sundays, and the library kept its doors wide for anyone who entered. But beneath that quiet rhythm, a scar remained. Neighbors still glanced at Highway 431 when they passed, remembering the night when taillights vanished and a life was swallowed whole. Families still locked their doors earlier than before. Trust had returned in pieces, never quite whole. For Martha's brother Daniel, the fading of public memory felt like a second disappearance. The world had moved on, but he refused to. His determination burned quietly, even when others stopped asking. And one day that determination would matter, because a shift was coming. After nearly a decade of stillness, fresh eyes and new tools would open the file again, and long-buried details would rise to the surface. Would you like me to continue with the part where the cold case is officially reopened and the investigation takes on new energy? For years, the case of Martha Coleman had rested in silence, a cold file gathering dust while her family carried the burden alone. Then, in November 2019, the stillness broke. A hunter walking through the woods near the Tallapoosa River stumbled upon something half buried in the earth. At first it looked like nothing more than a scatter of bones among the leaves and roots, but when he looked closer, his breath caught. These were human remains. Deputies rushed to the site, marking off the wooded ground with tape and stakes. Forensic teams moved in carefully, cataloging each piece of evidence with the patience of a long-delayed answer. Among the remains, one object drew every eye, a silver bracelet tarnished from years of weather, but still intact. Etched into the metal were two simple letters. MC. The engraving was enough to stop the town of Opelika in its tracks. The initials could only mean Martha Coleman. The woman who had vanished 14 years earlier had finally been found, not alive but in the silent ground by the river. News of the discovery spread fast. For a community that had nearly given up hope, the return of her name to the headlines brought a rush of emotions. Relief that at last there was something real to hold on to. Grief that the truth came not with life but with loss confirmed. Candlelight once again lit the town square, and voices whispered Martha's name into the night. But with the discovery came questions sharper than ever before. How had her remains ended up miles from where her car was found? Who carried her there, and why had the trail been invisible for so many years? Would you like me to continue with the part where forensic analysis begins to piece together what happened to Martha on that final night? The bracelet alone stirred belief, but investigators needed proof that could not be questioned. The remains from the Tallapoosa River site were sent to the state lab, where forensic teams worked with quiet precision. First came the comparison of dental records, laid side by side with files from Martha's years of checkups. The alignment was exact. Then came the DNA analysis, matched against samples from her brother Daniel. Days of waiting turned into an answer that carried both certainty and sorrow. The remains were Martha Coleman's. The announcement came in a packed press conference at the Opelika courthouse. Detectives spoke carefully, confirming that after 14 years of searching, the mystery of Martha's disappearance had shifted from uncertainty to tragedy. Cameras flashed, reporters filled their notebooks, and behind the officials stood a family who had carried this weight for nearly 2 decades. Daniel lowered his head, the confirmation cutting deep even as it offered the closure he had begged for. Across Opelika, the reaction was swift and emotional. Neighbors who had prayed for her return gathered again in the church pews. Candles flickered along the steps of the library where Martha had spent her last working hours. A memorial service brought together old friends, colleagues, and strangers who had never forgotten her name. The town spoke her story out loud again, not as a missing person, but as someone whose life had mattered and whose absence had reshaped them all. Yet even with this confirmation, another truth hung heavily in the air. The remains told them who, but not how. The answers that could explain her final hours were still hidden, and investigators knew the hardest questions still waited to be solved. Would you like me to continue with the part where the forensic team begins to uncover what those bones reveal about Martha's death? The lab results carried more than confirmation of identity. They carried the silent story etched into Martha's bones. Forensic experts began their careful study, and what they found turned the case from a disappearance into something darker. Several ribs on the right side showed clear signs of cracking, the kind consistent with a powerful impact. More chilling still, the skull bore an indentation on the left temple, a blunt force injury that pointed to deliberate violence. The pattern did not suggest an accident or a fall. It suggested assault. As investigators sifted through the evidence, one detail caught their attention. A small fragment of gray synthetic fabric was found caught among the remains. It was too deteriorated to immediately identify, but it was enough to suggest close contact with another person or object at the time of Martha's death. With these findings, the status of the case shifted. Martha was no longer listed among the missing. Her file was reclassified as homicide. This official change struck Opelika like a second shockwave. The community that had spent 14 years torn between hope and despair now had to face the truth that Martha had been killed. Outrage spread through the town. Neighbors gathered in the square, voices rising with the demand for justice. The library where Martha had spent her final day became a place of flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. For the people of Opelika, this was no longer just about remembering her. It was about holding someone accountable for what had been done. The reclassification of the case reignited determination in law enforcement and in the community alike. The silence had broken, and in its place came a vow that the person responsible would be found. But the question remained, where would the first real lead come from after so many years of shadows? Would you like me to continue with the part where investigators uncover an unexpected lead from the smallest piece of fabric? With the case now marked as homicide, investigators returned to the evidence box that had sat untouched for years. Inside were carefully sealed bags containing items too small and too fragile to have yielded answers in 2005. Strands of hair, the tiny gray fabric fragment, smudges of latent prints barely visible to the eye. In the early days of the investigation, these pieces had seemed useless, but modern forensics had advanced, and now they carried new potential. Specialists turned to next-generation sequencing, a powerful tool capable of pulling genetic profiles from even the faintest traces. Under the lab lights, the gray fabric fragment surrendered its secret. From its worn fibers, analysts extracted male DNA. The same process applied to one of the hair strands delivered another profile, also male. For the first time, the investigation had genetic evidence pointing directly to another person. The samples were rushed into CODIS, the national database, in hopes of finding a match. Weeks passed as the search ran its course. When the results came back, the outcome was disappointing. No direct hit. Whoever this man was, his DNA was not in the system. The evidence told investigators someone had been there with Martha, someone whose violence left scars in her bones and traces on her remains. But the name behind that DNA still remained hidden. Faced with the wall, detectives made a decision. If CODIS could not deliver, then they would turn to the new frontier of forensic genealogy. With the help of a company called Orem, the DNA profiles would be mapped against public databases to build out family trees and narrow the circle until a suspect emerged. It was a gamble that had cracked other cold cases across the country. And in Opelika, it would soon bring the investigation to a man who had spent years walking free in plain sight. Would you like me to continue with the part where the genealogy results point investigators toward a surprising and unsettling family connection? The work of forensic genealogy is slow and painstaking. Analysts at Orem began building family trees from the fragments of DNA, tracing matches to distant cousins and third relatives scattered across the country. Piece by piece, the branches narrowed, guiding investigators toward a cluster of names that pointed back to Opelika itself. At the center of that cluster stood one family that the town already knew well, the Dawsons. When detectives followed the threads, a chilling realization emerged. The genetic trail connected directly into the Dawson line, and with that, a name long known to the investigation returned to the forefront. Richard Rick Dawson, the neighbor who had argued with Martha, the man questioned back in 2005, the one who had offered a solid alibi and walked away untouched. After years of silence, the DNA evidence was now pulling him back into the circle. For investigators, it was a moment of grim validation. The suspicion that had hung in the background for so long was not misplaced. But suspicion alone was not enough. To move forward, they needed direct confirmation. They needed Rick Dawson's DNA on record, matched cleanly against the evidence from the fabric and hair. Only then could the weight of the case shift from suspicion to certainty. The team vowed not to let this opportunity slip. The case had slipped into cold silence once before. This time they would not allow it. Every step from this point carried the pressure of years lost and justice delayed. The town of Opelika had waited nearly 2 decades for answers, and now the man at the center of the storm was within reach again. The question that hung in the air was simple but heavy. How would investigators secure Rick Dawson's DNA without alerting him too soon? Would you like me to continue with the part where detectives use a quiet strategy to gather his genetic sample and finally test the truth? Investigators knew they could not walk up to Rick Dawson and ask for his DNA. If he had been guilty, such a move would send him running or force him to cover his tracks. Instead, they turned to a quieter method. For weeks, they placed him under discreet surveillance, following his routines, watching his stops, and waiting for the moment when carelessness would provide what they needed. It happened in the most ordinary way. One afternoon, Rick finished a bottle of water while working in the yard. He tossed it aside without thought, leaving it at the edge of his driveway. On another occasion, he smoked a cigarette outside a gas station and flicked the butt into the trash. To him, these were habits forgotten in seconds. To the investigative team, they were golden opportunities. Each item was collected, sealed, and rushed to the lab under chain of custody. The wait for results carried a tension that could be felt across the department. When the call finally came, the answer was clear and sharp. The DNA pulled from Rick Dawson's discarded items was a perfect match to the male DNA recovered from the fabric fragment found with Martha's remains. Years of doubt collapsed in a single confirmation. The man who had once walked free under the shield of an alibi was now tied directly to Martha Coleman by science itself. Inside the department, there was no cheering, no loud celebration, only the heavy silence of relief and resolve, the quiet acknowledgement that after so many years, justice was finally within reach. The paperwork began at once. Detectives prepared to move for an arrest warrant, knowing the next steps would bring the case into the open once more. But when the warrant was signed and the time came to act, the arrest of Rick Dawson would send shockwaves through Opelika, stirring both old wounds and new questions. Would you like me to continue with the part where the arrest unfolds and the town faces the man now accused of Martha's murder? On the morning of January 14, 2023, Opelika woke to the sound of sirens and the sight of flashing blue lights cutting through the dawn mist. Police units surrounded the modest home of Richard Rick Dawson, their boots crunching across the frosted grass as they approached his door. After nearly 18 years, the man once treated as a neighbor and dismissed as a dead end was about to face the weight of a murder charge. The knock was firm, followed by the command to open up. Rick stepped into the doorway, his face pale but calm as if he had already sensed the shadows circling back toward him. Officers read the warrant aloud. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and even then he shook his head slowly. He spoke words that echoed across the yard. I am innocent. I did not do this. For the officers who had chased this case across decades, his denial was expected. But the scene was no less striking. Neighbors peered from their windows, stunned to see a man they had waved to for years led away in silence. Some whispered disbelief, others felt a chill of recognition that the suspicions from long ago had not been misplaced. News of the arrest swept through Opelika within hours. Headlines carried his name, and the town divided in its response. Some could not believe that the same man who sat in church pews on Sundays, who fixed cars at the garage, and who raised his children in their schools could be accused of such violence. Others felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place at last, even if the picture they formed was painful to face. The courthouse steps filled with reporters, cameras flashing as officials confirmed the arrest. After so many years of silence, the name of Martha Coleman was spoken aloud once more, no longer in whispers of mystery, but in the language of justice. Yet even with Rick Dawson in custody, the path ahead was not simple. A trial was coming, and with it the battle between evidence and denial, between truth and doubt. Would you like me to continue with the part where the case is brought before the court, and the fight for justice moves into the courtroom? Inside the Opelika police station, the interrogation room felt colder than usual. Hours stretched as detectives pressed Rick Dawson with the evidence that had taken nearly 2 decades to build. He sat at the steel table, arms folded, his face unreadable as they laid out the timeline piece by piece. They reminded him of the car left abandoned on the roadside, the purse untouched, the keys still in the ignition. They described the cracked ribs, the blow to the temple, the fragment of gray fabric recovered beside Martha's remains. Rick's answer was steady but unchanging. He insisted he was innocent. He claimed again and again that he had nothing to do with Martha Coleman's disappearance. His voice did not rise, his hands did not tremble. It was the kind of calm that unsettled those across the table. Then came the moment that shifted the room. Detectives slid a folder toward him. Inside was the bracelet engraved with the initials MC, and alongside it the DNA report that matched his genetic profile to the evidence found with Martha. For the first time, Rick's expression faltered. His eyes dropped to the papers, his lips pressed tight, and after a long silence he leaned back in his chair. His words were simple: "I want a lawyer." With that request, the interrogation ended. The room that had carried tension for hours fell quiet. Detectives knew they had reached the limit of what they could draw from him directly. The case was no longer in their hands alone. It was time to pass the weight of years' evidence and grief into the courtroom. The files were compiled, the reports sealed, and the handoff to the prosecution team began. Opelika had waited a long time to see this moment, and now the battle would shift from closed rooms to public halls of justice. But as the trial preparations began, another question loomed heavily. Would the strength of science and evidence be enough to outweigh the denial of a man who still swore he was innocent? Would you like me to continue with the part where the courtroom drama unfolds and the trial begins in front of a restless community? The prosecutors began shaping the case with the precision of builders laying a foundation. Had the core stood the DNA, undeniable and exact, linking Rick Dawson to the fragment of gray fabric found with Martha's remains. Around it they stacked the other pillars, the cracked ribs and skull indentation that proved violent trauma, the silver bracelet with her initials discovered near her body, the witness who reported a scream that night, another who saw headlights veer suddenly down an unmarked dirt road, and most damning, the unexplained gap in Rick's alibi around midnight, when co-workers could no longer account for his presence. Together, these pieces formed more than evidence. They formed a story that prosecutors believed showed exactly how Martha's final hours unfolded. Their theory was stark. Rick intercepted Martha along Highway 431 as she drove home. At some point, an assault left her injured, her ribs cracked, her temple struck. He then staged the scene, leaving her car by the roadside with her purse and keys untouched, creating the illusion that she had stepped away. Afterward, he carried her body to the woods near the Tallapoosa River, leaving her there in silence for more than a decade. The narrative was not built on speculation alone. It was stitched together with science, testimony, and the trail of absence that Martha's life had left behind. The prosecutors knew they were asking a jury to believe in a chain of events hidden for 18 years. But with every link, the chain grew stronger, pulling Rick Dawson closer to a conviction. In Opelika, the story of Martha Coleman was no longer a whispered mystery. It was becoming a courtroom drama where truth and lies would be measured piece by piece, and in that courtroom, the first witnesses would soon take the stand, their voices carrying the weight of a town's memory. Would you like me to continue with the part where the trial begins and witnesses bring the story of that night into sharp focus? When September 2023 arrived, Opelika gathered at the courthouse with a weight that could be felt in every corner. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled by townspeople, reporters, and family members who had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment. A jury was seated, their faces solemn as they prepared to carry the burden of judgment. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The prosecution opened first. They wasted no time placing DNA at the center of their case, calling it the spearhead that cut through 18 years of silence. They described how next-generation sequencing pulled Rick Dawson's genetic profile from the fragment of gray fabric, and how that profile was later confirmed with his discarded cigarette and water bottle. They reminded the jury that science does not fade with time. The forensic findings of cracked ribs and a blow to the skull were laid out as proof of homicide. Finally, they presented the timeline, a coherent sequence that linked Martha's last sighting, the abandoned car, and the discovery of her remains into one tragic but undeniable story. Then, the defense rose. Their approach was measured but sharp. They argued that collecting DNA from discarded trash raised serious questions about privacy. They insisted that DNA might show presence but not the act itself, suggesting that Rick's genetic material could have ended up on the fabric through innocent contact. They leaned heavily on the faded memories of alibi witnesses, pressing the idea that after so many years, details blur and certainty cannot be trusted. The clash of narratives filled the room. On one side, the prosecution's firm belief in science and sequence. On the other, the defense's attempt to carve doubt from the cracks left by time. For the jury, the path forward would depend on which voice they trusted more. And soon those voices would not only come from the lawyers, they would come from witnesses who had lived through that August night. Voices that carried echoes of headlights, screams, and silence. Would you like me to continue with the part where the first witnesses take the stand and begin to recount the haunting details of Martha's disappearance? When the witnesses began to take the stand, one name carried an air of tension before she even spoke. Laura Bennett, Rick Dawson's ex-girlfriend from 2006, walked to the witness chair, her steps measured, her eyes fixed ahead. The courtroom leaned forward as she took the oath, the memory of years past about to be laid bare under oath. She described moments from her relationship with Rick, the ordinary evenings and conversations that in hindsight seemed to carry darker weight. Then came the line that froze the room. She recalled Rick saying once in an offhand way that the library lady from back then did not make it home. The words seemed casual at the time, she admitted, but they never left her. Hearing them again now in this courtroom, they struck with the force of a hammer. Immediately, the defense rose to object, challenging her statement as hearsay, arguing it was unreliable and dangerous to let a jury consider. The judge weighed the matter carefully, the silence stretching as everyone waited. At last he ruled the testimony could stand, but with caution, reminding jurors that its weight must be judged alongside all other evidence. Despite the caution, the effect on the jury was impossible to miss. Some shifted in their seats, others exchanged fleeting glances. The idea that Rick himself had once hinted at knowledge of Martha's fate was not easily dismissed, even if delivered years after the crime. The prosecution let the moment hang before moving on, knowing sometimes silence can underline a statement more deeply than any argument. For Martha's family in the gallery, the testimony was both painful and powerful. Another piece of truth long hidden finally finding its way into the light. But Laura Bennett was not the only one whose voice would carry weight. Another witness had seen something on that August night that would pull the jury closer to the road where Martha vanished. Would you like me to continue with the part where the highway witness recounts what he saw and how it deepens the mystery of that night? When Daniel Coleman walked to the stand, the entire room seemed to grow quieter. Martha's younger brother carried the kind of grief that does not fade, and even before he spoke, jurors could feel the heaviness he brought with him. His voice was steady, but every word carried years of pain. He described the morning after Martha vanished, when her desk sat empty, her coffee mug untouched, and the phone rang with no answer. He remembered stepping into her house, seeing her bed neatly made, the curtains still drawn, and realizing in his gut that something was very wrong. He spoke of filing the police report and of the first nights when the family clung to hope, waiting for a call that never came. As his testimony continued, he told the jury how the years stretched into a hollow silence. Birthdays came and went, holidays passed, but the chair meant for Martha was always empty. He spoke of their mother, who lit candles and prayed long into the nights, believing she might still see her daughter walk through the door. When she passed away in 2011, Daniel said it felt as though Martha had been taken from them twice. The courtroom listened without movement. Even the defense did not rise to object. This was not evidence of DNA or timelines. This was the cost of 18 years of unanswered questions. Daniel's words anchored the trial in humanity, reminding every juror that behind the science and argument stood a family that had been broken and was now fighting for a measure of justice. When he stepped down, many in the gallery wiped their eyes and the jury held expressions heavy with the weight of his testimony. But after the voice of family came the voice of science once more, as the forensic expert prepared to take the stand and explain what the bones themselves revealed. Would you like me to continue with the part where the forensic pathologist presents the medical findings that frame Martha's final moments? The courtroom sat in tense silence as the jury filed back into their seats. Hours of deliberation had passed behind closed doors, but now 12 faces returned with the weight of justice in their hands. The foreperson stood holding a slip of paper that would end nearly 2 decades of questions. The judge asked for the decision, and the words rang out with clarity. Guilty of first-degree murder. Unanimous. A hush fell across the room, followed by a sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Martha's family clutched one another, tears running freely, the verdict both a relief and a fresh wave of grief. On the other side of the courtroom, Rick Dawson sat still, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed as though refusing to accept what had been declared. The judge moved swiftly to sentencing. The crime, marked by brutality and by the long years of silence it imposed on a grieving family, left little room for leniency. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, sealing the decision, and the case that had haunted Opelika for 18 years had finally reached its legal conclusion. Reporters rushed outside to deliver the news, while townspeople who had gathered in the square embraced one another. Some wept openly, others shook their heads in disbelief, still struggling to reconcile the image of a church-going mechanic with the man convicted of murder. Police officials gave brief remarks, emphasizing the persistence of investigators, the importance of modern forensic science, and the determination to never let Martha's case slip into silence. They called it a victory not only for justice, but for the principle that no crime should remain forever hidden in the dark. Yet even with the verdict delivered and the sentence pronounced, the story of Martha Coleman carried an echo. For a town forever changed and a family forever marked, the question remained of how memory and justice would live side by side in the years to come. Would you like me to continue with the closing reflections that bring together the legacy of this case and the lasting impact it left behind? The trial had ended, but Opelika was left with the uneasy truth that a killer had lived among them all along. Rick Dawson had not been a stranger in the shadows. He was the neighbor who fixed cars, the man who bowed his head in church pews, the familiar face at the grocery store. That reality shook the town more deeply than the verdict itself. People wondered how they could have missed the signs, how someone so ordinary could have carried such a secret for so many years. Church leaders spoke from pulpits about vigilance and faith in the face of darkness, reminding congregations that evil often hides behind masks of normalcy. Civic groups held forums to reflect on what the town had endured, and how they could rebuild trust while never forgetting Martha Coleman. The impact reached far beyond Opelika. In Montgomery, Alabama officials announced new funding to support cold case investigations, emphasizing the role of modern DNA testing and forensic genealogy in solving crimes once thought impossible to close. The Coleman case was cited as proof that persistence, technology, and community will can break even the heaviest silence. Back in Opelika, Martha's memory was honored with annual memorials held at the modest red brick church, where she had once sung hymns. Neighbors gathered not only to grieve but also to reaffirm a promise that no one else would ever fade so quietly into mystery without the town standing watch. What began as a single disappearance on a hot August night had become a story of loss, justice, and resilience. The community carried scars, but it also carried lessons about vigilance, perseverance, and the enduring power of truth. And still, even with justice served, the name Martha Coleman lived on, etched into the collective memory of a town that would never again take ordinary evenings for granted. Would you like me to finish with the closing reflection that ties Martha's story to the larger theme of hope and remembrance? In the fall of 2023, Martha Coleman was finally laid to rest with the dignity that had been denied her for 18 long years. The service drew the entire community together, filling the red brick church with soft hymns and quiet tears. For the first time since that summer evening in 2005, Martha's family could gather not in search, not in protest, not in a courtroom, but in a farewell that was both solemn and complete. Her gravestone bore a simple but powerful inscription: "Beloved daughter, sister, and friend, brought home at last." Those words were chosen by her brother Daniel, who spoke during the service with a voice that wavered yet carried strength. He told the gathered crowd that their family had lived in the shadow of absence for far too long, but now they could carry Martha forward, not as a mystery, but as a memory. He said, "We finally brought her home." The moment carried a weight that reached beyond Opelika. Editorials across Alabama framed the case as proof that justice delayed does not have to mean justice denied. National broadcasts revisited the story, emphasizing the blend of perseverance and modern science that broke the silence of a cold case once thought unsolvable. For many, Martha's name had become a symbol, reminding the country that behind every unsolved file lies a family waiting for answers. As the final hymn faded and mourners filed slowly from the church, the town felt both grief and release. The scar of what happened would never fully fade, but the burden of uncertainty had finally lifted. Martha's story now stood complete, sealed by truth and honored by remembrance. Yet even as the Coleman family lowered their heads in prayer at her graveside, one lingering thought hung in the air. What does closure truly mean when a life so full of kindness was stolen? And could the town ever truly heal from the shadow it left behind? Martha Coleman's story reminds us of something greater than one crime and one conviction. It shows how perseverance can outlast silence, how science can uncover truth long hidden, and how a community that refuses to forget can bring justice even when the years seem too heavy to overcome. For nearly 2 decades, her case lay in the shadows, but the dedication of investigators, the strength of family, and the power of modern forensic tools pulled it into the light. It is a story of loss, yes, but also of endurance, a reminder that no matter how ordinary someone may appear, vigilance matters, and that the bonds of community can hold strong even when time tests them. Martha's life was stolen, but her memory endured, and in that endurance the truth was finally found. As Opelika continues to heal, the lesson stands for all of us. Justice may come late, but it never truly vanishes. It waits, it lingers, and with persistence it can still be brought home. If you are still here watching this story, it means this story deserves your like and your subscribe. Make sure you turn on the bell icon so you do not miss future stories on Unscripted Tales. Please help me complete 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target set by my mother for you. And it is totally free to support, and tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this story. Because every city, every voice, and every listener helps keep these cold cases alive in memory.